He's cutting my grass.
Yeah.
Bill Bailey and Henry Fraser like to kid each other about their gardening.
Secret files of the North Novas from day one to the end of the war.
The smiles turn to warm nostalgia as they look at old pictures and clippings of their wartime duty.
Just a book. Brings back a lot of memories.
Yeah.
A lot of ones that's hard to take. We lost so many boys over there, and you see their pictures and know you left them over there. It hits pretty hard, no matter how long ago it happened.
As members of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, both men were in the first wave of attack during the D-Day invasion, although Bailey says their worst action came the day after.
The second day was the worst action anybody could ever dream about being in. And then when we took it all the second time, it was almost as bad as the second day.
They each received a military award of merit from the King, while Henry got a slightly different piece of metal.
Piece of shrapnel hit me there. Frigged that hand up for a while. And they only kept me over. I was only back in England for, what, 8 or 10 days?
I left my brother over there. And he was my best friend I ever had. So it'd be awful nice to be able to shake hands with him on the 50th anniversary. But there was thousands like him that never went back.
Yeah.
And that's the price of war.
No, I'm glad I done it. And give him a hand out. Somebody had to do it. So it had to be us.
Ceremonies to honor the North Nova Scotia Highlanders will be held here at the Pictou Cenotaph on Sunday. And while younger generations will pay tribute to their sacrifice, veterans will stand firm in their resolve that it was a price they were willing to pay. In Pictou, Dan McIntosh, ATV News.
And all this week, leading up to the 50th anniversary of D-Day, we will be bringing you some outstanding stories about maritime contributions to the war effort, including, Nancy, some more on the North Novies and another instrumental regiment from northern New Brunswick.
Important lessons in history, really. Coming up next.
No, you certainly know by now that on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled landed in Normandy. After weeks of waiting, the invasion of Hitler's fortress Europe was about to crumble.
This evening, Bill Jessom has a retrospective on that morning 50 years ago and those maritime D-Day soldiers who were making an historic pilgrimage back to the beaches of that Norman countryside.
Utter confusion. Too many troops, not enough exits.
The skies over Normandy gray, the sea choppy, 2 meters high. The British will take Gold and Sword Beaches. The Americans, Utah and Omaha. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division's objective, take and hold Juno Beach, an 8-kilometer stretch of the Norman coastline. No easy task for green troops. But they proved just how good they really were. They beat the best, Hitler's 12th SS Panzers. Included in the 3rd were soldiers from the North Shore Regiment of New Brunswick and from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, including 2 companies, C and D, made up of Cape Bretoners and Prince Edward Islanders. Not so pleasant memories begin to stir in the minds of these veteran campaigners as they prepare to return to Normandy and Juno Beach.
We lost roughly half the battalion. About, I guess it was 84 killed, and the rest wounded and some prisoners taken.
McLangel was attached to an intelligence unit gathering information when the war ended for him.
A message came through from brigade, and I was the handiest one to it, I guess. I took the message and started to decipher it, and that was the end for me. Armor-piercing 88 shell come through the half-track, and I was taken out, the casualty, about noon hour.
Well, I'd say 99% of us were scared, and the other 1%, you know what they are. They're liars. Well, I thought it might be my last day on Earth. It was the last day on Earth for an awful lot of the boys.
One of the first Canadians to land in Normandy was New Glasgow native Roy Rushton of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, who dropped behind enemy lines with the British 6th Airborne.
Remember, everything happened so quick, we were dropped at a very low level. We don't know for sure just how low we were, maybe 500 feet. We have no way of measuring, but it was awful low. It didn't take long for us to get to the ground. As I say, there isn't too much to remember about it, how everything happened so quick.
Juno turned out to be the bloodiest of the 3 British beaches, and the price the Canadians paid, 340 killed, 474 wounded, 47 captured. For the record, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, despite heavy losses, advanced further that day than the British or Americans.
When we jumped over one of our dead comrades, we'd say goodbye, and if we jumped over a wounded one, we'd tell him somebody's going to pick him up pretty soon and everything will be all right.
I guess there's times when you get pretty scared and think about things like getting killed. And then you see your own buddies being killed. Of course, it brings home a message.
Young Canadians buried under foreign soil. Let us hope that we will not have any more.
From D-Day to VE Day, Canadians suffered nearly 50,000 casualties, including 12,579 killed in action. The very least we can do on Monday is to remember the fallen hero. Bill Jessom, ATV News.
Powerful stuff, Bill. We can't imagine what they went through on the beaches of Normandy. But Nancy had a great question while we were watching that item.
I wanted to know, what do you think would have happened if the invasion had failed?
Oh my, that's historians, military historians, have been agonizing over that for the last 50 years. And I'm sure Eisenhower, Montgomery, Roosevelt, and Churchill agonized over that. What if it failed? And it was a gamble. They would have been driven back in the sea, of course, and it would have taken maybe a year or two years. But I think with over 200,000 Allied troops lying over there still, the cost would have been too high. Historians suggest the atom bomb by the Americans, and that would have stopped it. Ended the war very quickly.
You have part 2 of your series tomorrow night. What can we look forward to?
It's a personalized report on an individual born in Stellarton, raised in New Glasgow, went overseas, joined when he was 16.
On those 5 beaches, we'll be returning to that rugged shoreline this weekend to meet old comrades and to walk Juno Beach one more time in honor of those 335 who never returned home. This evening, Bill Jessom profiles one of those maritime heroes of that historic invasion of Hitler's fortress Europe.
October 6, 1944. The invasion was the beginning of the end of Nazism in Europe. New Glasgow native Stan Dudka of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders became part of the Churchill Promise. As Stan strolls his quiet Nova Scotia beach, his thoughts are of that other beach across the ocean and what it was like fighting his way off the Normandy shore a half-century ago.
We were glad to get ashore. Everybody was seasick. And coming in on the beach there, I seen one ship going down, and there was only one British seaman. He was a sailor, and he was floating right on the bow of the ship as it was sunk. And they dropped some of our tanks overboard, which were supposed to float in. Some of them sunk. And there was a lot of congestion, a lot of butterflies and stuff.
It took C Company 3 hours to fight its way off Juno. That evening, Stan, still alive, and with the rest of the company that made it, dug in for the night. D-Day 2, June 7. C Company moves forward through the hedgerows. It's tough going, and it would turn out to be an unlucky morning for Stan and his buddies. They're surrounded by the dreaded and hated 12th SS Panzers, Hitler's fanatical youth.
We gave ourselves up. We surrendered to the Germans. Well, I don't want to go into the details. There was a lot of murders after that. We were taken to the Abbey of Ardennes, where Kurt Mayor's headquarters was, and there was 18 or 19 singled out, and they were kept in isolation, and apparently the next day they were all shot in the back of the neck. And there was murders as you were captured. There was, in my estimate, around 45, somewhere around that, were murdered outright.
Every time Stan looks at or eats a
tragedy for
plum,
that day.
he's reminded of the little old lady who was kind to him and the other prisoners at that railroad siding.
There was a nurse, a nun. Now, she was passing out plums as we were past there, but one of the planes got her, killed her. She had a yellow dress on, but she showed me her identity card before that. She was a nun there, but she was killed by one of them. And it was during that time that I figured that you're going to die anyway, so I might as well try to escape, so I did. And I made a successful escape. It took me 10 days to get back to the lines, to my own lines.
Once back with his unit, Stan fights his way across France, Holland, and eventually over the Rhine and into Germany. Although a powerful young man, battle fatigue finally takes its toll.
I had lost 46 pounds while I was a prisoner, and I should never went back. I wasn't physically fit because one day in the shelter, I tried to get out of the trench, and I didn't have the strength. I couldn't get out of there. I dug the trench too deep, and I just couldn't get out of the doggone thing at all.
One thing this D-Day veteran will never again take for granted is his freedom. He lost it once.
You could never realize the value of freedom until you lose it, until you're a prisoner of war. And then you realize what you lost.
The Canadians who left our shores more than 50 years ago to do battle on another shore will downplay what they did as anything but heroic. But what they did on Juno Beach that morning was indeed heroic. And they were those who remained in everlasting sleep and those who returned home heroes, every last one of them.
No, I'm not a hero. The ones that are heroes are the ones that were left over there.
And as usual, a story well told, Bill, and I guess it's not surprising that Mr. Dudka had a difficult time talking about Kurt Meyer and the execution of his friends.
He's very emotional about that. Even after 50 years, after the war, he went back and gave evidence against Kurt Meyer. But Monday night on with Steve Murphy at 6 o'clock, Rick Grant's been working on a story about Kurt Meyer, about the atrocities, about what happened to him, and how he was treated, and what just desserts supposedly he received for all of those atrocities.
I've heard a bit about that. Fascinating story, and also a fascinating story from you, Bill, here on Live at 5 on Monday, D-Day over the past week, but I can guarantee you that you have not heard this one, and it's only on Live at 5. Fascinating tale leading up to D-Day and surrounding the whole story.
And now they formed a great armada for the liberation of France.
Prime Minister Chrétien now about to unveil a plaque, one of several that will be unveiled around Gosport today. And as you can see, it says, to commemorate the embarkation of Canadian troops from these Gosport shores for Normandy on the 50th anniversary of D-Day.
And hallow this plaque, which we dedicate in gratitude for those Canadians who embarked from this place in defense of freedom, that their memory may be cherished by generations yet to come. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
There are, of course, veterans from all over Canada here at the D-Day commemorative ceremonies. One of them is Arnold Jefferson. He is from Bridgetown, Nova Scotia, and he is with me now. Good of you to take the time. I appreciate it. What are your memories 50 years plus after D-Day?
When we got in the beach, when we were offloaded, the beach and the roads and the little village, fishing village, was loaded with troops. We landed on Juno Beach, as you know, and this was the access route for all Canadians that were coming in at that particular time. But as soon as they got in and off the beach, then they went out to their different areas because they all had objectives. Ours was the city of Caen. But we got there, and as I say, the beach was loaded with people, and we couldn't get off the beach because apparently we found out later that Jerry had his SS headquarters in the city of Caen, and that was our objective on D-Day. Anyway, and they were on a scheme, and they were at the top of the hill facing this little village, this little fishing village. They were dug in with automatic weapons. So anything that moved and tried to get out around from that village was fired on. That held the whole thing up. We had to get troops around to take those guys off of the guns, out of the slit trenches. Everything moved ahead.
You must have had some very sad memories, though. As you think back, you were a major in the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. Didn't you have to write some of the families of men who were lost?
That was one of the jobs, that's right. That was a tough job. But it's something you have to do. You're trained to do certain things. And when you go in action, and I've often been asked, were you scared when you land on the beach? But I didn't have time to get scared. I had a job to do. And my main job was to get these people moving so that we could sign the route. So when the tanks come in, they could see the 69 sign, just the same as signing an area. And we had a big field where we assembled. Tanks drove in, troops were there, they unloaded first, and every man knew what tank he was going to go on. The idea was to get cracking, because we expected to be in Caen that evening.
Now, just think back very briefly. You were a young man then. This was the greatest amphibious landing in the history of war. When you think back, does it boggle the mind that you were there?
Tremendous, yeah. When you think of the logistics behind all this, you know. But the particular day, D-Day, I didn't have time to think of much else except my job. And I always figure if anyone does their job and tries to do it properly, if it works out, everything is okay.
Mr. Jefferson, good of you to take the time now to share their memories. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, as you can tell, Allison, my guest, is a very modest man. He is so modest, in fact, that he won the Croix de Guerre from the French government for service in France during the war, but he was so modest, he did not want to talk about it.
Well, as important as the remembrance of all of this is, I know that for many veterans, the memories must be sometimes difficult ones and also difficult to talk about. But for now, Don, let's look ahead to tomorrow.
In Normandy this weekend, thousands are in Ottawa remembering a day that turned a war around. Sunday Edition's Terry Marcotte has the story of two veterans who hadn't met until this weekend, but whose lives were in each other's hands 50 years ago.
Private Stan Hughes, a young farmer from Nova Scotia.
When you see your best buddies laying on each side of you and you have to go on, it's hard to forget things like that.
Ken Smith, a 21-year-old university-educated naval lieutenant from Montreal.
The whole day had sort of an unrealistic effect. If I said it was Hollywood-like, that would be diminishing it.
Fallen friends, brushes with death, the most vivid, haunting memories of those who survived D-Day. But in many ways, the stories of Ken Smith and Stan Hughes paint the picture of cooperation and teamwork that made D-Day such a huge Allied victory.
Anybody that ever told you they weren't scared, they're lying.
Hughes was part of a second wave of soldiers who pushed forward on the beaches of Normandy.
You saw bodies lying everywhere. Some wounded, some dead, and vehicles bogged down in the water. Just a living hell.
What were you thinking at the time?
I was so scared I wasn't thinking. I was running to get off that beach and get inland.
He made it inland, well past Allied protection, where he was captured the day after D-Day. he'd remain a prisoner of war for 11 months.
From the moment you become a prisoner of war until the end, it's just a threat over your head all the time. You didn't know when they were going to shoot you.
As he travels by train to Ottawa to gather with other D-Day veterans, memories of those months in captivity come flooding back.
The place is in a boxcar and started a journey across France. For 23 days we were in that boxcar. And everybody got so thin and so dirty and filthy that we all had lice. And when we got out of the boxcar, we could hardly stand on our feet. Memories I wish I could forget, but I can't.
D-Day had to be #1 in terms of overall impression and the staggering enormity of the whole event.
While Stan Hughes and thousands of other Canadians were landing on the beaches, Ken Smith was watching from a British flagship leading a Canadian assault. His ship made it through D-Day untouched. From his watch post, Smith saw the battle unfold.
I had front row center for what was going on. We were in the command ship. We saw everything was going on. We knew what to anticipate, what to expect. We saw the assaults going in. There were traumatic moments where you would rather not recall some of the things that you actually saw because you hoped it wasn't real at the time, and it's still reality in the mind.
While Smith and his crewmates pounded shells into German defenses, he could see the Allied battle was going well. The people who landed on the beaches were pushing forward.
There was no doubt that I was proud to be a Canadian.
Take your time, Mr. Hughes.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Now, as veterans prepare for a weekend of reminiscing, the pride is still fresh.
I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
You look spiffy in this. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Thousands of D-Day survivors gathering to bask in the glory of victory 50 years later.
Right! Turn!
Comrade, how are you?
Oh, Nova Scotia Highlanders. Oh, gosh.
Never the great outfit.
Oh, one of the best.
Most of the D-Day veterans here hadn't met each other until this gathering. They've grown older, had their careers, had their families. But never have they forgotten those bonds of youth with complete strangers who they trusted their lives with.
Suppose you could sing that song, the gravy in the Navy, you'll get used to it.
Yeah, that's right.
A chance for Ken Smith and Stan Hughes to share their experiences.
50 years, where does that go?
I talk to my youngsters, and they're vaguely interested, but it's like it's the Crimean War, you know? There's no way they're going to feel the same things that you and I felt.
Finding out how their lives came together in battle so long ago.
We put down a very, very heavy bombardment towards calm because you fellas were ashore.
It's the victories, the good times they talk about.
Did you get a medal for that?
The times they helped each other out.
We're very proud of you.
And we're quite proud of you, the Navy.
Well, we tried.
There are some memories that need no reminder.
Here's to absent friends. Absent friends.
Boys that I went to school with, jammed around and played ball with them. And they were all gone. I can still see them. I can almost reach out and touch some of them.
For Sunday Edition, I'm Terry Marcotte in Ottawa.
And when we return...
Word is given, advance.
Good morning to you on this Friday, June the 3rd, from a special D-Day set on Canada AM. Keith is in an even more special D-Day set. He's in fact in Normandy at Juno Beach. He'll be there throughout the weekend and on Monday with Lloyd Robertson covering the ceremonies. June 6, 1944 will always be an important day for Canadians because it signaled the beginning of the end for Hitler's Germany and was a significant mark for Canada's coming of age. The contribution of the Canadian soldiers as they crossed the Channel and the importance of their landing and the efforts they made that day are tremendously important. And we will be talking about that coming up right after the news with Wei Chan. Different people around the country that we are anxious to talk to. One of them is with us now. His name is Don Chapman. He's a veteran of D-Day. He was a member of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. He is in Moncton, New Brunswick right now. Looking very elegant there with your medals. How are you, Mr. Chapman?
Hi, Valerie.
Now, I don't know if you've been listening to this, and certainly there have been all kinds of programs and special commemorative editions of magazines, etc. I'm just interested in having your thoughts on as we approach the 50th anniversary of D-Day?
Well, to start off with, the North Novas were part of the, not part of the initial assault. We were to follow through after the assault, initial assault had been made, and therefore we didn't have too much action on that first day, the early part of the first day. Once the beachhead had been secured, then we were to advance inland, and we got, and most of the action didn't move for us until about 5 o'clock in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
And then we, because when darkness came, we decided, or the commanders decided, that we would stay where we were for the balance and continue further on the next day.
Yeah, and you had an enormously difficult job, didn't you? I mean, grisly, tough job. Part of it ended up being picking up bodies.
Yes, that was on. That was quite a while later. That was after the second assault through Authy, and on the drive on into Caen, and the Padre and I had to go, and one other member went around picking up these bodies that had been killed in the initial assault on the D+2, and or not D+2, D+1, and some, of course, on D+2, and the ones that were killed later on the second assault towards Caen, which was sometime in around the around the 8th of July.
Yeah.
And it was pretty disastrous. I guess disaster is not the word, but I felt to see people that I had grown up with and been in the Army with for 6 years or 5 years, and to not to recognize some of them, and some you couldn't recognize. The only way that you knew was when you looked at the dog tags and saw whose name it was, because they were so the bodies were so badly mutilated, and you can imagine laying out in the sun for a month almost, some of them. It was pretty horrible.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your being there to talk to us today and being able to remember what the North Nova Scotia Highlanders did, and thank you so much. I just wanted to bring Terry Kopp in here, who's our historian and written a number of books about this. He's with Wilfrid Laurier University. I mean, they talk about moving up the Canadians toward Caen, which was the objective, but what it was they were fighting against and the kind of resistance they met.
Well, on D+1, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, the Armoured Regiment, made the move from Benny and Buisson, trying to get to Carpiquet, and the 12th SS had arrived overnight, and one of their regiments blindsided the vanguard. Kurt Meyer was here in the tower of the Abbaye Ardennes overlooking them, and that was the beginning of a process that's very important for people to understand. The country in the Caen area is wide open, and the Germans threw the bulk of their armor in against the Canadians and British in this sector, so that the battle in Normandy, particularly in our area, became a brutal battle of attrition. Sometimes we tend to think it should have been done some other way, but the truth is the enormous weight of German defensive power in this area required a series of battles like the one the North Novas fought on D+1, and we're to fight again on July the 8th with other troops.
Okay.
He is meeting a lot of Canadian veterans because a lot of Canadians embarked from Gosport to go to D-Day, the beaches of Normandy. And David, a lot of them there, remembering, I'm sure, their friends as well.
Yes, I think for veterans, one of the things that is important is obviously to come back and see the old places, but what goes through their minds is the memory of the friends they had then, the friends that didn't come back. I mean, that experience of going into war as young men was really shaped their lives, and there's a bond between veterans that one can't imagine, I think, if one wasn't involved. And then they are just tremendously preoccupied with the memory of those who didn't come back, young men whose lives were simply cut off in their prime.
Well, among the crowd in Gosport today is my colleague from the CBC's London Bureau, Anne McMillan. Anne, give us your view from Gosport.
Well, as you've just seen, the Prime Minister is right behind me, and he's getting a very warm welcome from the people of Gosport and also the Canadians. And you've got to remember, it's not just Gosport who honor and revere the Canadians. They were a major hit in Britain during World War II.
50 years ago today, Gosport was preparing for war. Thousands of soldiers, many Canadian, boarded ships which would take them across the English Channel to D-Day. The area around Stokes Bay had been a hive of top-secret activity for months. Owners of houses overlooking the water had been moved out. The bay was closed to civilians. Few Gosport residents had any idea what was going on here. In a corner of the bay, work was being done on a section of a mulberry harbor, an enormous structure crucial to the invasion. After the failed raid on Dieppe in 1942, military planners realized it was impossible to establish a beachhead without a harbor. It took 20,000 workers 9 months to build 2 harbors, which were towed to France on D-Day. Because they were built in sections, even those involved with the harbors didn't know what they were. Len Hayward, an officer with the fire brigade, worked in this area. He and his crew were puzzled by the strange structure in the bay.
There were various stories. Some said it was concrete battleships. Somebody said they were going to block some harbour with them, but nobody really knew what they were for.
The bay was also used for training exercises to get troops ready for the assault on the beaches of Normandy. Canadian regiments like the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Winnipeg Rifles were here, continuing an association with Gosport, which began in the First World War. Then Canadian women donated a wing to the Hassler Hospital, a naval hospital which treated wounded Canadians in both World Wars. As D-Day drew near, troops were sealed into their camps. French money was distributed and French maps. And soldiers made final preparations for the battle ahead. Winnie Coombs served Canadian soldiers in her family's Gosport pub. She'll never forget the day her boys went off to fight.
The activity was so great. They were coming down this road, and every road, every turning, side road, every little lane was packed with vehicles and men. They literally picnicked outside the front door. There was nowhere else to... They ate everything on the road. They cooked in the road. They slept on the pavement and slept in the gardens and garden shed.
Len Hayward watched the embarkation from his fire station.
As they came in, the organisation was terrific. There was no congestion. There was no great build-up. There was movement going on all the time. And as one lot loaded, the next batch came in. Some had Bailey bridges on the front, some had great rolls of chestnut fencing on them, other one had great flails on them. It was extraordinary to see all these things.
We knew that D-Day had to come, and we knew, and they all felt, I'm sure, the same, because they would get home all the quicker, that as soon as we got the thing over and done with, it was inevitable anyway, let's get on and get cracking and get the damn thing over and done with. And of course they all went off in great spirit. And as they went out of the door, I used to think to myself, well, God bless you, I hope you come back.
15,000 Canadians left that day. Many did not come back. It's their sacrifice, above all, that is being remembered today.
Perhaps one of the most poignant moments I had when I talked to some of these people from Gosport was a gentleman who had authority to come down to the beach area during the build-up to D-Day, and he said he's never seen anything like it. The entire sea was full of boats, ships, battleships, everything. And he said the morning of the 5th of June, he came down very early in the morning, and it was a beautiful morning, and he said it was so shocking because there wasn't a thing on the sea. It was empty. Everything had gone. And he said he felt very lonely. He felt left behind, and he wished he had gone with them.
Right, Ann, thank you. I hope you can stand by. Maybe we can talk later.
We knew we'd die, or some of us would die. Some would get wounded.
I don't think that I ever thought what war was all about. I was naive. There's no getting away from it.
I liked the Army, and so as quickly as I could get into the regular force, and that's where I went.
I was quite convinced that if we didn't win that bloody war, we could have been goose-stepping up and down the main drag.
On D-Day, the men you just met were still in their teens or barely out of them. The days and weeks that followed helped shape the lives of Charlie Martin, Don Chapman, Lockie Fulton, and Richard Greer. We've brought these veterans together to give us a glimpse of the war through their eyes. CBC journalist Dan Bjarnason spoke with them before he left for Europe.
Okay, gentlemen, I wonder if I could ask you, first of all, why would you do something as illogical as to join an enterprise where you could be killed? Why would you join up to go to war? Was it the adventure? Was it you needed a job? Was it you get a uniform and impress the girls? Why would you join up in the first place? Lockie, why don't you tell me first?
I think probably I was commissioned about 38. And then, of course, when the war came along, the dragoons weren't mobilized, but here's the local soldier boy who has been wearing a uniform for a while. The war's on. This is my opportunity, and so that really led me into the Army. I mean, simply on the basis of I was a militia soldier. I couldn't stay at home and.
Why couldn't you stay at home? I don't understand why you couldn't stay at home. There was no draft.
I didn't want anybody saying, well, look at this guy. I mean, here's one of our local soldiers who's, the war's on now, and that's what he supposedly was being trained for, and time for him to get going. And of course, that isn't totally true, but I liked the Army, and so as quickly as I could get into the regular force, that's where I went.
But did it happen to guys that didn't join up? It was expected of them, and they didn't. Were they treated as lepers or outcasts?
I think, no, I wouldn't think so, although I think generally that those that joined up were looked at a little more favorably than those that didn't.
Charlie, why did you join?
Well, I think a little bit different than Lockie. Our regiment mobilized, of course, in 1940. June, and most of these men had jobs and they were working in Toronto. I think our boys joined up basically, and they're all afraid to say this, of course, naturally they're all afraid. They joined up because they loved their country. There's no question in my mind that this was the truth. They loved their families and they loved their church, and after they had joined up for their country, they read the newspapers. They'd read about Warsaw and Amsterdam and London. They'd read about the men and women being killed in the streets. They knew all about this. So I think they basically joined up on myself. And it takes a lot of courage to say this for soldiers because we don't like to admit it. But we joined up because we loved our country, Canada.
Why does it take courage, do you think?
Well, it takes a lot of courage to say that you love your country. To stand up and say that. Canadians don't like to do that. And obviously, this generation, the same as my generation, we didn't like to say we joined up because we love our country. That was the reason we did it. We knew we'd die, or some of us would die. Some would get wounded. And I think we were more afraid of losing an arm or a leg or going blind, than we were of actually being killed. I don't think being killed scared them very much.
I never even gave it a thought. No. Really, I don't think that I ever thought what war was all about. I was naive. There's no getting away from it because it was an adventure as far as I was concerned. And I never even thought about dying or anything like that.
Richard, why did you join up?
Oh, I suppose there was glamour involved. I was 18 or 19 or something.
Nothing about saving democracy, eh? It was...
I think somewhere in the back of my mind that hung around, but I don't say that I was... I didn't see a guiding light or anything like that at the time, no.
How did your family and friends take to this? I'll bet that your girlfriends thought it was a wonderful idea, and I'll bet your mothers were appalled by this.
Well, my mother didn't seem to panic too much about it because she had 5 kids. And I think she figured, well, at least he's got a job, or words to that effect.
My mother was very British, and so was my father. So I suspect that they were quite happy that I had joined up, you know, to save Britain, really.
You guys, how did your family take to this?
Well, my girlfriend at the time, Dan, is my wife today, and her father had been a Boer War vet. He was a canon in the Anglican Church, and I immediately went up in his estimation when I departed for the war.
Well, I have to disagree, you know, on all that counts, because I have at home 50 letters that the mothers wrote to me after their sons were killed. And if you read those letters, you would cry for hours. And if you don't think your mothers weren't upset, well, I'm going to tell you they were.
Could I ask you all, what was your impression of what this war was about? Did you realize it was sort of a tyranny, an unspeakable political system that you were fighting against? Or what did you think this was being done for?
Well, I believed what was common thought at the time, that, you know, we had to put a stop to this. And I even felt that if we don't put a stop to this, and England has to give up, we're going to end up with a lot of the enemy running Canada. I mean, it sounds weird at this particular time, but I was quite convinced that if we didn't win that bloody war, that we could have been goose-stepping up and down the main drag.
Is it easy, or was it easy to enlist? Was there a lot of red tape and rigmarole? Charlie, you had to do a little adjusting of your height.
Well, I had a little trouble because I was a little short, you know, and it was an interesting story. Well, I was a farmer, of course, and there was no need for me to enlist, so I was coming down my old star, and the brakes failed.
You were coming down, I'm sorry?
Down Dundas Street in the brakes failed, on this little hill by Hyde Park. And of course I managed to get the car stopped, and the policeman pulled me over, and he said, well, where are you going? And I, you know, without thinking, I said, I'm going down to enlist. He said, okay, hop in. He said, we'll put the car in the garage and I'll take you down. So that's, so he gave me a ride down. So when I got there, we had to wait up in the balcony, and at that time, you had to be 5'8", you see. There was restrictions. Later on in the war, you could be 5'1", and they wouldn't bother. So it was a cement floor, so I put a piece of the telegram at that time in my socks.
The newspaper?
Newspaper, yeah, and that did the trick, you know.
So you cheated to get into the war?
Well, I would have cheated to get out if I'd had a chance when they started shooting at me. No, I think it was a job that had to be done.
We'll meet again with our panel of veterans during each of our evening specials over the next 3 days.
I never heard an English person, all the time I was there, ever give a consideration of going to lose the war.
We had a guessing game in our company as to whereabout are we going to land. And nobody ever did guess.
Oh, just miles and miles of vehicles everywhere, and tanks and carriers and trucks and motorcycles and bicycles by the thousands.
A lot of us have been in England a long time, and we were thinking, let's get on with it. The sooner we get this caper over with, the sooner we'll get home.
Charlie Martin, Don Chapman, Lockie Fulton, and Richard Greer are 4 of the thousands of Canadian soldiers who lived and trained in Britain before D-Day. We first met them last night when they talked with Dan Bjarnason about why they joined the war. Tonight, they discussed their time in England and how they got ready for the fight of their lives.
Gentlemen, let me ask you what it was like in Britain when you arrived there. What kind of a country were you arriving? The place had been under siege for 2 years, probably. What was the nation like that you arrived in?
Well, of course, they were all on rations. And once again, I never heard an English person, all the time I was there, ever give a consideration of going to lose the war. And when you walk through London and see the bombing, and they really showed appreciation to the Canadians. They treated us like the Canadian citizens.
What did they do? I mean, are there any incidents? Did they take you to their homes?
Oh, yes. We didn't realize it at the time, but they would invite you for tea and cookies to their house. And of course, when they gave you a cookie or a cup of tea, it was their cup of tea or cookie, not. They didn't have lots to spare. But they were quite willing to treat the Canadian soldiers just as if they were their own sons.
What was training like? Was it realistic? Was it really valuable? Did it turn out to have some practical application later on D-Day? How real was training?
I think that we were probably the best trained troops in the UK. And I'm referring now to the D-Day operation. We had rehearsed that thing over again and landed on beach after beach. It was the same infantry, the same tanks, the same artillery, the same landing craft, so that we almost built up a team effort. And so that when we did go over on D-Day, we were all vomiting our heads off, or I was, but because it was rough. But I think that that is what made our landing thing a success, was this repetition, repetition, repetition.
I think the training was pretty realistic. One of the things that probably, if you want to compare training and training that the Germans did, is that they probably had maybe a little more experience in some of their instructors. They'd seen action, and actually in the Canadian Army it was rare that you run into somebody that had actually had any battle experience. So the training from that point of view may have been just not quite as realistic as it could have been.
What did you think of your equipment? What were Sherman tanks like?
Well, it wasn't until we got into Germany that we realized our tanks were pretty antiquated, and we were well outdistanced by the German tanks, because those Shermans just brewed up, you know, and where we had 3 inches of armor on the front, they had 16 inches of armor. We had a 75 millimeter gun, they had an 88 millimeter gun.
Did you know that going into combat, or?
No, I didn't. We found out quickly, though. It came upon us all of a sudden.
But wouldn't that make you lose faith in your equipment, in your tanks?
I don't think we really thought about it. You know, you lost a tank, and you may have had a guy killed and 1 wounded, which was a sort of ratio. And then you'd say to somebody, go back and get another tank.
The Sherman tanks that you were in were called Ronsons.
Yeah,
why were they
right,
called Ronsons?
Well, for the lighter, you know, the cigarette lighter, because they did brew up very, very fast.
By brew up, you mean they caught fire?
Caught fire, yeah.
Did you know this before D-Day?
No, they didn't give us a course on that at all, I can tell you. They didn't. They kept that as their little secret, so we didn't know about that.
I'll bet the Germans knew it.
Oh, I'm sure they did. Well, they'd probably run into them down in Italy, so they had a pretty good idea of how to handle the situation.
Prior to D-Day, how much did you guys know? I know it was top secret and you wouldn't know much, but you must have had some hunches and some I betches and this type of thing.
In the transport, we weren't even allowed inside the compound, where they kept them all under guard for about 2 weeks there, and we didn't even know what was going on. We just sat outside with our vehicles, and we couldn't talk to the people over the fence even. We weren't allowed to, because they had been briefed on what was to take place.
Richard, how much did you feel about what was going on?
Well, first of all, before we got put into the lockup, or whatever we called it, where it was we didn't know a hell of a lot. We knew we were going somewhere, but we didn't know the details. Then once we got locked in, in about a 20-foot barbed wire fence. Then they'd start telling us. But even then, the maps they gave us had fake names on the maps. It showed the terrain, and it showed, you know, for example, Caen, but it wasn't called Caen on the map. But this was to show us where the rivers were, the roads were, but still not tip us off as to what towns we were going to. And so the security was very, very, very tight.
We had a guessing game in our company as to whereabout are we going to land. And nobody ever did guess that it was going to be Courcelles-sur-Mer or Benny-sur-Mer or Normandy even.
How did the authorities make sure you guys didn't get a little gabby? Was your mail censored, or was it an honor system, or could you make phone calls?
The mail was censored, there was guards on, but I think, no, they had no disregard to any rank. I think if the enemy had had any good spy system, it shouldn't have been too difficult to find out. All they had to have was one major, one company commander, I'll take that back, or that knew for 2 weeks ahead of time in their, in their spy system. So I was really surprised that they didn't know where we were going.
Richard and Don, do you have any reflections of the state of morale in those final 2 days?
Well, we were outside the compounds, and we parked our vehicles, and we couldn't even move them because they were all geared for, they were gassed up, and they were geared for assault landing with waterproof. So we just had about 2 weeks, so we just walked up and down the roads because the side roads were just loaded with vehicles of all sorts and everything. And when time came for to eat, they used to line us up and march us in, and we weren't allowed to talk to anybody inside the compound at all. We'd line up and get our food and march us back out again. And
paint a picture for me of those country roads with the trucks to the horizon. What did that look like?
Well, we knew there was something up pretty soon, and it was, just miles and miles of vehicles everywhere, and tanks and carriers and trucks and motorcycles and bicycles by the thousands.
Yeah.
Bicycles. And as soon as we landed, all the French people had Canadian Army bicycles.
I was going to say.
Richard, do you have any thoughts of your frame of mind in those final hours, in the final day or two?
No, I think it was perhaps a feeling, well, thank goodness we're going to get on with the job, because we'd been in England, a lot of us have been in England a long time, and we were thinking, when the hell are we going to get down to business? And I think that was my feeling. Well, thank goodness, let's get on with it. The sooner we get this caper over with, the sooner we'll get home, that sort of thing.
We'll take a short break now. Please stay with us. When we come back, we'll have highlights.
Just as we were approaching the beach, you could see a complete silence, as if everybody had stopped breathing.
I think the thing that struck me was seeing somebody fall over, and all of a sudden, reality hit him. I mean, he's been hit.
You know, you lost a tank, and you may have had a guy killed and one wounded, which was the sort of ratio. And then you'd say to somebody, go back and get another tank.
I joined the Army to do a job, and I hoped that I could do the job that they expected of me without turning cold.
The day they landed was unforgettable. Charlie Martin, Don Chapman, Lockie Fulton, and Richard Greer were 4 of the Canadians who stormed the beaches of Normandy. Over the past 2 nights, they've shared their memories of war with Dan Bjarnason and with us. Tonight, they talk about D-Day itself.
When you're boarding the ships to take you across the channel, what's running through your mind? Is your heart beating a little faster now? We haven't actually set sail yet, but you're getting on the ship. What's running through your mind?
We knew that was the real thing, of course, unless it was called out. But the men were just normal. They carried on. You didn't see anything unusual. And I think the only real tension you start to feel was after we got off the mothership in the assault landing craft. Just as we were approaching the beach, you could see complete silence, as if everybody had stopped breathing. And that, I think, was the first real sign of tension.
What was your crossing like? The actual, once we're underway now across the channel, what was it like? Was it rough? Was people sick? Were they singing? Was it quiet? Were they praying?
I don't know whether I'm different than most people, but I can sleep anywhere, anytime. And after we set sail, I was standing up at the prow of the boat, and there was a big wave came over and soaked me right through to the skin. So I was kind of disappointed that I I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I'm soaking wet. So what I did, I had a bedroll and laying on the top of the ammunition in the back of the truck, so I called in that bedroll and I went to sleep. And I don't remember anything of the crossing until we got to the other side.
You must be the bravest guy I ever met.
I'm not brave, no way. I'm not brave, but early in the morning, it wasn't quite daylight when I woke up. So I didn't get sick going across like everybody. I know everybody else did because of the smell of the stuff from all
You're a
over the deck.
maritimer. You're not supposed to get sick.
It was a very good Davenport or couch or something in the cabin that I could have laid down on and had probably gone to sleep like Don, but by now the tension is there. I mean, the adrenaline was running and I simply couldn't go to sleep, so I went up on the bridge with the captain. Even in the gloom, you could look to either side of you, and this is something that's always stuck in my mind. You would see every shape and size of ships all moving quietly in exactly the same direction. And it seemed to me all you heard was a murmur of engines and maybe the waves hitting the bow of the ship. And there was no wireless. There was wireless silence and there was no chatter of wireless. And the captain and I had some pretty good discussion as we went across. And I think, in a way, he felt kind of bad because he felt he was leading us to our doom.
Charlie, what was it? Was the reality anything like the anticipation?
The thing that upset all the men was the casualties. They'd lost men that had been together for 4 years, and pretty well they'd all lost 1 or 2 or maybe 3 people that they'd been soldiering with for 4 years. And I think this is the thing that really got to them.
But you knew there'd be casualties.
Oh, we knew there'd be casualties.
Why was it such a shock when it actually happened?
Why it's a shock when it happened. You always feel that your company and your section and your platoon and yourself, you're not going to get hit. That's just an inner belief. And of course it comes as a great shock when you see half a platoon, like my 9 platoon, my own platoon was half wiped out on the beach, was killed. This is very hard to take.
I think the thing that struck me was seeing somebody fall over. And all of a sudden, reality hit him. I mean, he's been hit. And you could see them, it's not often you see machine gun bullets, but they were plowing little troughs through the water. So you, in a sense, could almost see it. I don't think that I really realized. I think perhaps Richard said something there that come home to a bit to me too, is to see somebody see your first dead soldier, whether he's a German or a Canadian. That's reality.
Let me try this. This is what strikes me is the difference between a movie death and a real death with shooting is a movie death is kind of clean. So there's sort of a noise and somebody's not standing up anymore. In reality, it's not clean.
But I think the real thing is, too, first, these are men that are your friends and you've been comrades with. The ones you see in a movie, you don't know those. You see, they're unknown people. But if it was your brother or sister laying there, this becomes a different story, people that you know.
You're going into combat, the front of the boat drops down, and you know there's people out there shooting at you, and they don't want you to get to the beach. Every instinct you've got says, don't leave the boat. Why do guys leave the boat?
I don't want to sound Hollywoodish, if you know what I mean. I can't get into that sort of glamorous end of the thing. I think they did it because they joined the Army to do a job, they were trained to do a job, and they were disciplined and did it.
I joined the Army to do a job, and I hoped that I could do the job that they expected of me without turning coat and run. And you did it. And I was able to do it.
Did you young men, did these young men think of themselves as being particularly brave?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. It's just the nature of the beast, I guess, that he had a job and he was going to do it at the best of his ability.
But Lockie, everybody says they had a job to do, they had a job to do, but this wasn't their job. This wasn't thrust on them, this was something they chose to do.
I think that once they volunteered and became part of a unit, the esprit de corps pretty well settled what they would do. I mean, this is my outfit, wherever they go, will I go to.
You could not see 1 inch between one plane or another. The sky was black from one end to the other.
We didn't think the war would last that long, I don't think. The majority of it, we didn't realize it would be on for 4 years.
You just did the best you could and went on with life, because what else could you do? You had to go through this to get the end of the war.
I was almost afraid to go down and meet him. Somehow I thought, so long, you know, and what if he doesn't like me anymore?
Men weren't the only ones fighting the war, and of course they weren't the only ones whose lives were changed by it. The wives of the veterans you just saw had dark days and victories of their own. They sat down with Dan Bjarnason to talk about their experiences.
What did you women think your husbands were doing? I mean, you knew they were in the Army.
Yeah.
But what did you think they were doing? Did you know what? Did you have any idea what they were training for, or what?
Yes. Yes, you did know what they were training for. That eventually you always felt that there would be an invasion of France, or you always knew that was going to happen. And the thing was that when it did happen on D-Day, that I can remember that first of all it was just starting to get light, and you heard this terrific roar, and it would continue and continue. It ended up that everybody was outside on their lawns in their pajamas and dressing gowns, looking up, and you could not see 1 inch between one plane or another. The sky was black from one end to the other, as far as you could see.
Nellie, describe to me your D-Day morning.
Well, my father was downstairs having breakfast, and he turned on the 9 o'clock news or the 8 o'clock news, whatever, on the radio, and I heard the D-Day, the landing, what was it?
Invasion.
The invasion has begun. The salt companies have landed in Normandy, and I knew Lockie was leading one, so it was a very anxious time, and I was really very fortunate, because the next day in the Free Press, Winnipeg Free Press, it showed a picture of him and said that he succeeded in reaching his target for the day and had been awarded an immediate DSO.
Now, was all of you, when you heard it, when you heard that D-Day, or suspected it, that it was happening, was your first thought of your husband, my God, this is now affecting, this isn't some abstract thing, this is affecting my life?
I think you first thought of that, and then you prayed. I think you did a lot of that. I think we all did.
Vi, was your first thought of, my God, Charlie's over there somewhere?
Well, I thought, thank God at last it's happened. That's really what I thought, and then I prayed. That's really what it was, you know.
What'd you pray for?
For him to be saved, his life to be saved. I know it was a very selfish thing, but, you know, he was my husband, you know.
How did women like yourself deal with the anxiety that would go on for months or a year almost of having a husband in the middle of a war?
It's the first thing I think you thought of in the morning, you know, when you got up. And the best thing you could do was, we used to send cigarettes and parcels, you know, as often as we could.
But it must have made you afraid to even listen to a newscast or pick up a newspaper.
Yes.
If it was about your husband's unit or a part of the front where he was, it would have been terror for you.
Yes, that's right. You avoided the papers, I think, as much as you could.
How about you, Vi? Was this, how do you go through a year of this? With no let-up, there's no break in it. I mean, the husband could go on leave, you can't.
Well, I think we opened up to each other in letters. Like, you know, we always said how much we loved each other and so on and so forth, and what we hoped for the future and stuff like that. And you had your job to do, and he had his job to do. But the first letter I got, I just remembered. When I first met Charlie, he was with a Sergeant Simpson, Jack Simpson, on the beaches. And he was the first person that he wrote had been killed, you know. And after that, there was a litany of... But he never said killed. He always said, we have lost. We have lost Jack Simpson. We have lost so-and-so. And then you sort of got used to that, and you just did the best you could and went on with life, because what else could you do, you know? I mean, this is the way it was, you know, and you had to go through this to get the end of the war.
And you were on duty. You're still doing your job. So you just kept on, and I never really thought Richard would be killed.
But we
Isn't that extraordinary?
But we didn't think the war would last that long, I don't think. The majority of people, we didn't realize it would be on for 4 years. A year or 2 years, that was in the back of our mind, I think.
Now, Nellie, you wanted to enlist, but you couldn't because you were pregnant. What was it like being in that position in the middle of a war with your husband on the other side of the world?
Well, I think maybe I was disappointed, really, because we'd been going together for 3 years. We'd been married for less than a year, and I was really anxious to get over and hope to see him again. And I guess I was disappointed.
Can you remember when he first saw your child after the war?
I was very nervous. You know, I was almost afraid to go down and meet him. Somehow I thought, so long, you know, and what if he doesn't like me anymore? I don't know, but it was frightening. Well, then I didn't have Bruce with me, our little boy then. We left him with Lockie's mother.
But when they first met, that
when
must have
they
been
first met, I imagine it would be like, I don't know. You see, Bruce would have my father as a sort of male figure to grow up for this first 4 years, and Lockie had never been a father, so I would be inclined to think it must have been very strange.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back...
On D-Day, when I took the roll call and found out that we had so many killed and wounded, I was really upset. I went behind the wall and had a big cry.
As far as building up an immunity to fear, I never could. I was scared out of my wits so many times, but I had a quick recovery.
When you hear a moaning mini let go, you get fear. The fins on them are geared in such a way that they make the most god-awful sound you've ever heard in your life.
The only thing that kept you going was a slurp on the old rum and then a few pep pills and hard-tack soda biscuits. I don't know how the hell we did.
It's one thing to understand the cold facts and figures of war. It's another to grasp the emotions of it. Over the past 3 nights, we've called on 4 Canadian veterans to help us understand. Tonight, they talk with Dan Bjarnason about their impressions during those dark days in Normandy.
What determines, you think, in combat who lives and who dies? Is it skill or is it luck?
I think the more skillful you get, the more experience you get, the better chances you have of surviving. I think they do go hand in hand then. But luck has got to be. Luck to survive 11 months of battle in an infantry battalion, you've got to have some luck.
I was in a slit trench. There was 3 of us, and we were laying across the slit trench, and we had the mud dug in front of us like a parapet. And the German Schmeiser let go, and the fellow on that side and the fellow on that side both got hit in the head and killed. And I was in the center. I'm still here. But that answers your question. Luck.
Charlie, how do infantry soldiers come to grips with so much death and so much random death when there's no predictability to it? There's no determining who. It's not necessarily the brightest or the best or the stupidest.
Well, that's not quite true, because when if I'm going to send your platoon forward or your section, you know that you're attacking, you're going down the road. You have to use cover, you have to use all the cover you can, but you have to keep going forward. And sooner or later the enemies will open fire. So it's a lot of skill.
But how do you come to grips with so much mayhem and killing? How does this, how do you accept it and go on?
I think in my own case, I can speak for that, is that, of course, on D-Day, when I took the roll call and found out that we had so many killed and wounded, I was really upset. I went behind the wall and had a good cry. But after that, I was just said to myself, well, they're dead. We have to finish the job. And that's what we did. We went on from there, we finished the job.
Lockie, can you build up an immunity to your buddies getting killed, and can you also build up an immunity to being terrified yourself?
You have to live with that. You know you're going to have casualties. That's the biggest worry of any attack that you're responsible for. But as far as building up an immunity to fear, I never could. But what I did have, you know, I was scared out of my wits so many times, but I had a quick recovery. And I think that helped me to forget that particular experience. And but as far as an immunity to fear, I never managed to do that. But I think the quick recovery kept you from becoming a battle exhaustion case.
Richard, what are your thoughts on the insulating yourself, vaccinating yourself against fear?
Well, I never succeeded in doing it. I mean, you run into your moments of terror, and I had my share of mine. And I think the thing that pulls you out is the fact that you have a responsibility to your tank crew, your tank squadron, or your whatever. And therefore, you sort of have to discipline yourself mentally and get on with the job. I think that's the way I see it.
Don?
When you hear a Moanin' Mini let go, you've got fear. Lots of fear.
A Moanin' Mini is what, a German mortar, is it?
It's a bank of German mortars, and they have the fins on them are geared in such a way that they make the most god-awful sound you ever heard in your life.
What did you young soldiers make of the German soldiers? Did you hate him, respect him, or was he just doing his job, or was he a vile, evil force? How did he fit in?
Well, there were two brands of Germans. There were the regular Wehrmacht, or whatever it's called, which were not a hell of a lot different than us. Then you had the fanatic element, which were the Hitler Jugend, the 21st Panzer, and these kind of people. Now, these guys were absolutely dedicated to their cause and to their leader, whoever he might be. And the other thing I noticed with the Germans, that even if they got well beaten up, they had this fantastic ability to pick themselves up off the ground, withdraw to the next village, and regroup again. And one may have been, you know, half a dozen were infantry, another guy had a gun, somebody else. I mean, they were absolutely fantastic in what I call the survivor game. And I think these were the things that impressed me about the Germans.
Let's move on to something quite not as dramatic. What was the food like?
As far as we were concerned, we got ashore, and then we fought for 33 days, as other third div people did. And they had no way of bringing up any food, i.e. by truck or anything like that. And so we lived on these hardtack, which was a soda biscuit, sardines, sewer trout, and what was the other damn thing? That Spam.
Oh, yeah.
And then what they called meat and vegetables, which was grease that far. And then, anyway, and of course, we couldn't light a fire to cook because, so the stuff all had to be eaten cold. And I got a stomach ulcer after the war, and I lay most of the blame on that. It was the food. But what kept us going, as I remember, it was not so much the food, but we got a jug of Navy rum and kept it in the tank where it was handy. And then they gave us pep pills. And these are wakey pills. Because we were working from sun up, and sun comes up very early in Normandy, but like 4 in the morning. And we were busy fighting all day, and then at night we had to gas up again and reload the tanks with ammunition and try to fix any odd things. And then, so you didn't get your throats cut by these night patrols that the Germans used to send out. You had 2 men on duty and 2 men sleeping out of a tank crew. And so you were getting about 2 hours sleep per night for 33 days. And the only thing that kept you going was a slurp on the old rum and then a few pep pills and hardtack soda biscuits. I don't know how the hell we lived.
How do you sleep? You're in the middle of a war. Well, how do you, it's noisy. How do you sleep?
I remember going to sleep in a slit trench. And at that time, I thought I'd look more like a warrior with a mustache that was way out here. And I'd wake up, the mustache had turned down and it was full of sand, you see. But you just slept wherever you got the opportunity.
How important to the morale of the troops at the front was mail? Getting it and receiving.
Very
important. Important thing. That was the big day when mail arrived. As Richard said, you just almost could see a fellow when he was reading it. You know, his thoughts just turned to something else entirely.
It would, in a sense, I suppose, be a link with what they felt they were fighting for.
Parcels, the cigarettes, and the letters were one of the most important things in the whole war.
Stay with us. When we come back, more highlights of the day's event.
Across the country, veterans are reliving that day. Infantry Division.
Here you were watching this very event.
Meaning for Canadians. And here to tell us about that is the CBC's Keith Bogue.
In the small villages around Juno Beach, where Canadian soldiers landed 50 years ago, the shops and restaurants are festooned with the maple leaf. These towns were liberated by soldiers from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, and those who've returned are still treated as heroes.
Oh, all over, and welcome the Canadians, and, you know, they thank us for coming, and just tremendous. You know, they couldn't make us feel more at home.
Well, the pipes sound great. Oh, great for me. Yeah.
The pipes signaled the beginning of the Canadian ceremony. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and Governor-General Ray Natishin laid wreaths at the monuments honoring Canadians whose lives ended at this beach on June 6, 1944. Many countries' flags fly here. Many countries played a role in the Normandy invasion, but the burdens were not shared equally. Canada's contribution was greater than most countries and out of all proportion to its small size. Chrétien said no one should forget that.
Canada was a full partner with our allies, the United States and Great Britain. Not one of 30 nations, not one of 20 nations, but one of 3.
So much of this anniversary is naturally focused on the big picture, the extraordinary level of cooperation between national governments towards a single purpose. For many veterans, though, the big picture isn't the important one. The real reason they've come back here is to pay their personal tributes to the friends they've left behind. There are more than 2,000 Canadians buried here. Many of them died before their 20th birthday. Friends from 50 years ago searched them out. One man amongst the grave markers is Barney Danson. Not too long ago, he was Canada's defense minister. In the war, Captain Danson was Lieutenant Jerry Rayner's buddy.
And Jerry and Earl stole the 4th. Got killed later. And I'm here. So it's a luck of the draw.
Danson has been here many times before. Each time is more emotional than the last, he says, and he thinks he knows why. As he gets older, the day comes closer when there will be no vets left. And that brings the fear that one day the markers will lose their meaning. Keith Bogue, CBC News, Benny-sur-Mer.
There's much more to come from Normandy, but right now it's back to Toronto and back to you, Allison.
Thanks very much, Anna Maria. The ceremonies overseas weren't the only events commemorating D-Day. Here at home, thousands of Canadians marked the anniversary in a number of different ways. The CBC's Julie Van Dusen has that story.
The last post sounded. The flags were lowered to half-mast as veterans and dignitaries gathered to honor those who served, those who never returned.
50 years ago today, the Allies launched the greatest seaborne invasion of all time against the coast of Normandy.
It has been a time to tell stories, a time to pass on a message. Mel Clark was 23 with the Regina Rifles Regiment when he landed on the beaches of Normandy. He's anxious that his 6-year-old grandson never have to experience war.
Try to work in the message that war is a god-awful business.
Not to be glorified, but they want the lessons of war passed on. For days, hundreds of people have filed through the Canadian War Museum to contemplate the art and the artifacts. A new generation trying to imagine another era.
Nearly 5 years.
Norm Toslin remembers what it was like to be young and at war, parachuting into the darkness on the eve of the Normandy invasion, and the friends he left behind. 40% of his platoon was killed.
You're here representing the boys that didn't come back. Those are the ones we really want to remember.
My platoon boarded an assault craft to approach...
Across the country, veterans are reliving that day. David Dixon was 23 when he landed on Juno Beach with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division.
Here you were watching this very event, and you certainly felt you were part of history, or you were helping make history.
In Montreal this morning, the sound of church bells filled the air as 50 churches tolled in tribute to mark the anniversary. Just north of Montreal, D-Day soldiers and school children released 359 balloons for those Canadians who died at the Normandy invasion. In Richmond Hill, north of Toronto, D-Day veterans and members of the Legion paraded through town. In Winnipeg, they held a drumhead service, a prayer for those who fell in battle. Mel Clark lays a wreath at the cenotaph, his grandson at his side. Then the D-Day veterans leave, the sound of applause ringing in their ears as they march together, just as they did 50 years ago. Julie Van Dusen, CBC News, Ottawa.
Turning briefly to other news now, Canadians...
D-Day missing and deceased were remembered today by the playing of taps as Normandy villagers prepare for Monday's 50th anniversary commemorations. Dozens of our own vets, meanwhile, and Prime Minister Jean Chrétien returned today to the English coastal town of Gosport, the Canadian staging ground for the invasion of Normandy. Here in our region, meanwhile, ceremonies are being held this weekend in many communities to commemorate the 50th anniversary of D-Day.
There was one particularly moving one in Amherst, Nova Scotia. ATV's John Waterman tonight with the vivid memories of men who were on the front lines at Normandy and survived.
Ralph Tuttle was our first casualty.
Their memories are of a sea of humanity storming ashore at Normandy, of water-soaked, muddy trenches and thousands of young men, many of whom they grew up with, falling around them.
They're still 18, 20, or 21. I mean, you can't realize them. I mean, 60s, 70s, and probably more than that.
Al Murphy, I took him back to the field dressing station. And
These are the memories of aging men, battle-worn in their youth, who are in their own right heroes. The bronze figure of a Nova Scotia North Highlander proudly protects the honor list of local young members of the regiment.
Garnet J. Gallant, Medley Goodwin, Patrick Gautreau.
They're just 3 of the dozens of names inscribed here in bronze. The names of North Highlanders who were all killed in action a half-century ago. But for these veterans of D-Day, many of those names have faces.
I feel so sad lots of times when you think of the life that I've had, that they never had a chance.
North Nova Scotia Highlanders were one of 5 Canadian regiments that stormed the beaches at Normandy on June 6, 1944.
Jerry come in with the 88 of his. He could pin you down, boy, and I recall when I did get wounded that particular time, I had about 200 yards of open ground to go, and they was trying to get me. But the minute that I heard him coming, I ducked. I hit the dirt.
The D-Day invasion was the largest, riskiest, yet most successful military operation in modern history. But the men who were there say the recognition is sadly missing, especially in today's schools.
We can't expect our children to know anything about the Second World War unless they're taught. We're not taught in school anything. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And that is one mistake I think Canada made.
Today in Amherst, regimental colors were paraded, veterans and militia men and women marched to commemorate D-Day, sacrifices, and legacies.
Our first casualty in Sicily was a personal friend of mine, and we never want it to happen again. Yeah.
In Amherst, John Waterman, ATV News.
Of course, D-Day coverage continues right throughout the weekend here on ATV.
D-Day, the longest day. Today, Allied leaders and thousands of veterans gathered on the Normandy beaches, where invasion forces dealt a decisive blow to the Nazi occupation of Europe 50 years ago. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Live at 5. I'm Nancy Regan.
And I'm Bill Jessen. Paul Meunier is on vacation. D-Day commemorations have ended in Canada and, of course, in Normandy. But the memories linger on. Tonight on Live at 5, a look back to our future. A pledge not to forget the sacrifice Canadians made, and at what price.
The events on the Normandy beaches 50 years ago today will be burned in the minds of the troops who were there as long as they live. ATV's Jonathan Kay spent this June 6th talking with some Maritimers who landed on the beaches in 1944. Jonathan asked them what they remember most about the invasion, and usually, apparently, it's the moment the door on the landing craft swung open, when they saw the enemy for the very first time at very close range, and when they saw the sheer size of the operation in which they were to take part.
Everything was such confusing, you know, in those times.
This is the view Tom Colbert and his fellow soldiers faced 50 years ago. He'll always remember the moment he stepped off the landing craft into the water.
Only on the craft going in, I think that was one of the hardest things, because waiting was worse than moving. See? And the people were firing at you, but you couldn't fire back because you weren't ready.
The troops got off the craft into water that was between chest and waist high. It was cold, too, but they didn't notice. They were too busy to notice.
The North Nova was the leading battalion of the Reserve Brigade, 9th Highland Brigade. The 8th Brigade, the Queen's Own, had landed in front of us on the North Shore on our left. And the idea was that we were to land, pass through the 8th Brigade, and take the lead later in the day.
A radio operator with the North Shore Regiment, Oral Vino's most vivid memory of D-Day results from him being a prime target for German guns.
The Germans didn't like fellows with a microphone and a aerial sticking out of his back, and I always had the idea that the poor fellow coming behind me got a bullet that was meant for me.
Not just soldiers, but sailors too came ashore that day. Milton Kroll was in charge of one of the landing crafts that ferried soldiers from the ships to the beaches throughout the invasion.
A later trip, I would come ashore with my barge and go for a walk up the beach. And I saw in one particular section of the beach dead bodies piled as high as a two-story house. And I went up and I looked at some of those bodies, and they were some of the very ones that I took ashore. Yeah. And that will remain with me.
That's the thing we learn most about talking with veterans, is that no matter how much they tell us, no matter how many times we look at those pictures, it's really simply not possible for us to even imagine what things were like on those beaches, Nancy.
Jonathan, I'm curious, how are the veterans you spoke with today spending D-Day in 1994?
Well, that's almost as personal a subject as their memories, Nancy. Mr. Kroll, for example, spent today talking about his D-Day experiences for a luncheon with the Dartmouth Rotary Club. Other people are spending it at the Legion, surrounded just by other veterans, and still others are taking sort of a quiet day of solitude in quiet remembrance of the people who didn't come home with them.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Many moving stories, and now we want to take a look at how those moving stories were reported 50 years ago. Here's Bill.
Thank you, Nancy. The Second World War had been raging for 5 years before the D-Day invasion. So when word broke here at home, it was greeted with anticipation, a feeling that this would be the beginning of the end for Germany. Newspapers from across the Maritime screamed with headlines lauding the downfall of Nazi Germany. The St. John Telegraph-Journal has the Allies dashing into France from many beachheads. The St. John Evening Times Globe blares, "Invasion confirmed. Allies land in France." While the Sydney Post record posts, "Allies invade. Invaders seize beachheads in France." In Halifax, the Herald beamed, "Invasion strikes Nazis, says Allies land in France." While across town, the Mail proclaimed Beachhead 1 pushing inland. But before newspapers went to print, many Canadians first learned of the invasion with this historic broadcast.
This is the National News Bulletin, a summary of the day's news. The dagger pointed at the heart of Berlin has been driven into the side of Nazi Europe. The first news of the mightiest military operation of all history came at 38 minutes past 8 Eastern Daylight Time last, when the Germans broadcast a report that Le Havre was being bombarded. The official account is rounded out by dispatches from correspondents. They say that Canadian, American, and British troops landed on the Normandy coast in northern France. One report indicates that the Canadians may be among the troops fighting tonight at Caen, but the report isn't confirmed.
Many Canadians who landed on Juno Beach 50 years ago today are gathered once again in Normandy today to remember. Joining us now live from Normandy is correspondent Judy Fortin. Judy, it's been quite a day for Canadians there.
Nancy, it's been quite a day for all of the Allied veterans, about 35,000 in all. The sun is beginning to set here on the Normandy coast, and there are so many memories that the Allied veterans will be leaving this area with, and they have really become a part of history themselves. It's been said that this 50th anniversary commemoration is the biggest ever, and certainly the Canadians were a very important part of that. And your Prime Minister, as well as your Governor General, were among 17 other heads of state and government who descended on this region today. Actually, not too far from where I am right now on Omaha Beach. President Clinton was there from the United States, as well as Queen Elizabeth. It was a day of tributes and honor to those who 50 years ago risked their lives in this very area. Nancy?
Judy, Prime Minister Chrétien made a very emotional speech today. Can you tell me, what is the most prevalent feeling there? Is it sorrow for those lost 50 years ago, or pride in such a momentous achievement?
Nancy, it's both. Certainly for the veterans coming back, there is excitement over being treated as heroes, returning to the land that they were on so long ago, but also there is a solemn remembrance for all those people who died, and more than 9,300 are buried right behind me in this American cemetery. Certainly there are other cemeteries around this area too where there were tributes today, so definitely there's a little bit of both. And tonight the veterans are leaving with a lot to think about. It's been a very long day for all of these veterans, and they're glad this time when they come back at least that they're not fighting. They have a chance to at least enjoy and appreciate the ceremonies.
Before we go, I must ask, although you're obviously there in a professional capacity, has it been an emotional day for you as well to cover this momentous occasion?
It certainly has, especially being here at this cemetery. You have a chance to take a look over all the gravestones and realize that there were so many people who risked their lives here so long ago. It's hard to imagine that such a calm and serene place right now was alive and in the midst of a bloody battle for Omaha Beach 50 years ago. It's an amazing experience to be a part of.
All right, thanks very much for sharing it with us, Judy.
Thank you, Nancy.
That's Judy Fortin live from Normandy with a close-up perspective on a truly historical day. Now for a very different perspective, here's Bill.
Thank you, Nancy. As the public, veterans, and politicians observed D-Day today, there were some notably younger spectators who were front and center in St. John today. ATV's Sally Cummings is standing by live in St. John. Sally?
Well, they were grade 1s, Bill, from Island View Elementary who were on hand for the D-Day celebrations in St. John this afternoon, and the politicians were happy to see them there, and they told them that they hope they never forget the sacrifices that were made in World War II. Grade 1s waved their flags patriotically and listened intently to men in uniforms decorated with medals.
On this special day, we offer up a prayer. May the people of all nations be united in thy care.
And to all our future generations, we pray that our country will not ever have to go to war ever again, so that all of our young people will be able to have a good life and to live in Canada.
Why are you here today?
Because it's D-Day.
And what's that all about?
When all the people died of the war.
Do you think they understand what it's all about?
Probably not all of it, but I think they're starting to understand a bit, and I think if we do things with them, that they will understand more.
To remember the people that fought in the war for us, because they all died for our land.
This is why we're doing this stuff so many years ago.
Erin McPhee took a moment to explain the meaning of D-Day to her children, too.
They don't realize the whole picture of it, why they're doing this and why we wear poppies in November and whatnot.
This St. John High history class reflected on the war today and debated whether the sacrifice was worth it.
It's kind of a tough question, isn't it?
If D-Day had failed, the invasion would have had been put off for another year probably before they could have amassed the same number of troops and things.
Realistically, D-Day was a 50-50 chance. It was a gamble all the way, and it would have to go down in history as the most successful gamble in history.
And you'd have to wonder if the Allies didn't invade Normandy at that time, how much longer could Britain hold out?
And Bill, it's nice to see a younger generation taking such a keen interest and having such a good understanding of what D-Day is all about.
And Sally, looks like there was a tremendous turnout for D-Day observances in St. John today.
There were a lot of young people there, and the grade 1 children actually presented a flag to the city this afternoon, and the city will be planting a flower bed with the D-Day symbol on it, so the remembrance will continue all summer long.
Thank you, Sally.
Okay.
Live in St. John.
Know where he was going, but about years later, then I found that he was gone.
Caroline Young of Escazone is remembering her father, Private Charles Doucette, who was executed in action on June 7, 1944, after being captured by German troops from the 12th Panzer Division during the D-Day invasion. Private Doucette was one of the region's Micmac natives who served with the armed forces as a member of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. He was among a group of 20 prisoners who were shot by Commander Kurt Meyer in the Abidjan near Caen, France. Yvonne Colbert, the Second World War, the British government was forced to make one of the hardest decisions during that war.
It was a decision that remained one of the best-kept secrets of the war. Keep Hitler, should he invade England, from getting his hands on Britain's vast gold reserves.
Of all the British parliamentarians, Winston Churchill knew months before the fall of France that Britain would not be able to hold back the Nazi tide that was sweeping over Europe. There was only one way to keep Britain's vast gold reserves from falling into the hands of the Germans: ship every ounce of gold and other valuable assets to Canada. The French and Norwegian governments, on a much smaller scale, also became partners in this $7 billion transfer. And what's so surprising about this operation is the fact that the transfer of this enormous wealth from ships to trains was not discovered until long after the Second World War ended. I came across this incredible wartime story while researching another story at the Public Archives in Nova Scotia. There, in 2 boxes, were the personal collections of the late Frederick Smith, who was at the time General Superintendent, Eastern Division of the Canadian National Express. Included in the Smith collection were telegrams, waybills, and other correspondence showing the exact dates and amounts of the gold shipped to Canada. Of major concern of the British and French governments was getting the gold safely through the submarine-infested waters of the North Atlantic. But time was not on England or France's side. The German army was on the move. All selected securities were scooped up, packed in thousands of boxes, and placed aboard special trains that sped across the country to Scotland, where British warships waited to carry the precious cargo on a treacherous voyage to Canada. On an October morning in 1939, the first treasure ship sailed safely into Halifax Harbor. The shipment of gold bars, gold coins, stocks, bonds, and certificates would continue for the next 4 years. While military and other life-saving supplies were being loaded aboard merchant vessels for war-ravaged England, the treasure ships under tight security slipped quietly into Halifax Harbor. Waiting at trackside were special sea and express trains that would carry the gold safely out of the Maritimes to Ottawa and even New York. In New York City, the gold would buy Britain the much-needed war supplies. However, that was before the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. During wartime, Halifax Harbor and its docking facilities were the busiest in North America. But nothing remains the same. Only the memories of the way it was lingers. Most of the 600 people who were involved in the gold transfer have passed on, but not all. Ed Mahoney, a retired CN employee who just turned 80, remembers how heavy those gold bars were to handle and what it was like to ride the heavily guarded gold train west.
Stevedores unloaded it on dollies. They wheeled it across the shed between 2 lines of armed guards to the cars. We loaded the gold in the car, and I'm telling you, they were heavy.
Once a special train was made up, 50 armed guards, along with express employees, including Ed Mahoney, left the CN station in Halifax.
And we rolled through the night. Everything on the way had to pull into a siding to let us go through. There was no stop except for water and fuel. The glass in the cars were all blackened out. You couldn't see anything, and the guards were in the car and sealed up. Anybody that wanted in had to have the proper identification and signal before you'd open the door for them when they wanted to relieve you for your shift and all that sort of thing. But carrying the old double-barrel shotguns, I don't know what would have happened if somebody ever tried to get it, but they couldn't go very far with it.
The first stop the train made was Montreal. The vaults of the Sun Life Assurance Company's 24-story building, located on Dominion Square, became the wartime home for Britain's stocks, bonds, and certificates. The gold train's final destination was Ottawa, where under the shadow of Parliament, the gold was trucked to the Bank of Canada's vaults on Wellington Street. When the transfer was completed, the gold reached up to the ceiling. Surprisingly, Not a penny was lost or stolen. The gold and other securities would remain in Canada until the end of the war. Perhaps as Churchill, known for turning an appropriate phrase or two, might have said of the operation, never before have so many kept so great a secret so incredibly well. In Halifax, Bill Jessam, ATV News.
British subjects have returned to the beaches of Normandy 50 years after D-Day and what proved to be the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. The Canadians who stormed Juno Beach were honored and remembered at Bonneuil-sur-Mer at ceremonies attended by the Governor General and the Prime Minister today.
Great event of World War II known as D-Day. We remember courage, dedication, sacrifice, pain and suffering. We remember our soldiers, our airmen, our sailors, those who took part in that historic operation that was the beginning of the liberation of Europe.
They shall not grow old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
All those who are buried here must have understood that war is the sorriest admission of human failure. But they also knew that 50 years ago, the price of peace was war. They recognized that this was the apocalyptic battle between good and evil, between oppression and freedom. Whatever happened to them individually, they knew they were battling for life, the life of democracy. And they recognized that the battle was being waged against the death of the human soul that comes from being enslaved.
Normandy today, the Queen and French President François Mitterrand laid wreaths at Bayeux. Ceremonies across the 50-mile invasion zone featured more than 35,000 veterans from 8 countries. And at Omaha Beach today, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, President Clinton, the Queen, President Mitterrand, Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, and others paid tribute to the thousands of Americans who died during D-Day. Dozens of Canadians who died following the D-Day invasion did not fall in battle. They were murdered by SS troops commanded by General Kurt Meyer. He was charged with the murder of nearly 6 men and found responsible for the murders of 18 carried out at his own headquarters. ATV's Rick Grant tonight has the story of a Nazi general who went to Dorchester Prison instead of the firing squad.
In my estimate, around 45, somewhere around that, were murdered outright.
Stan Dudka was among the North Nova Scotia Highlanders who fought Kurt Meyer's SS troops and was captured on June 7th following the D-Day invasion. Dudka was in the Abbey of Ardennes, Meyer's headquarters, when the murders were carried out.
But they were shot right in the back of the neck with their Luger, and right behind Kurt Meyer's headquarters there.
General Meyer sent the corporal who fired the shots to a post in which he would face certain death.
Now, what does that tell you?
He wanted to get rid of NCO,
so he couldn't testify against him if he ever come to trial.
Bill Bailey, who was a company sergeant major with the North Novas, avoided capture that day.
I knew them all, yes.
Civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored.
In December 1945, a Canadian war crimes trial found Kurt Meyer responsible for 18 murders.
He was responsible in the same way that any commanding officer is responsible for the actions of his troops.
Kurt Meyer shot through the ranks of the SS and at 33 became the youngest German general and led the 12th Panzer Division made up of young men who progressed through the Hitler Youth, examples of the master race.
And was he a good soldier? I think he was a good soldier.
Author Tony Foster studied the career of Meyer, and Foster's father was General Harry Foster, who was among those who convicted Meyer.
My father, who convicted him, he didn't think he should have been convicted either.
Another Canadian general commuted Meyer's death sentence to life in Dorchester Prison.
Meyer did his time in this section of Dorchester, the prison hospital. He was essentially in protective custody here because by the late 40s and early 50s, some of the inmates were Canadian War veterans.
Incredibly, while Meyer was serving time in Dorchester for murdering Canadian soldiers, the Canadian Army dressed the Nazi general in a Canadian Army captain's uniform and slipped him out of prison.
They dressed him up as a captain so he could participate in a particular operation that they were doing up in Yellowknife.
Meyer served only 8 years for the murders, and he was sent home and set free in 1954. He died of a heart attack in December 1961, celebrating his 50th birthday. In Dorchester, Rick Grant, ATV News.
Memories are still...
The CBC's Anna Maria Tremonti on the Normandy coast. Anna Maria, when you're not off covering stories in other parts of Europe, you are the CBC's Berlin correspondent, and I know you've talked to German vets about D-Day. How does that color your perspective as you watch this story unfold today?
Well, interestingly enough, Allison, D-Day, as you actually might have figured, does not play a big role for Germans. They don't know a lot about it. Children growing up don't hear a lot about it. The veterans there, what amazed me was, for the most part, the people that I talked to who were here on that day fighting for the German side now look back on all of this as a terrible tragedy, and they really see it as something that stole their youth and something that they have no real pride in, except that they fought for the country that they thought they were doing a duty for. It's interesting as well that I've talked to individuals on the streets of Berlin, and they've said that D-Day in effect liberated them as well from the tyranny of their Nazi leaders. But for the veterans themselves, this day is a day they feel that the Allied veterans should celebrate and should acknowledge, and that they have every right to celebrate and acknowledge. And there's a bit of melancholy in it all, because they look back and they see how many people died throughout it all, and they feel a lot of sorrow. Also, there are German veterans here in this time, and some of them have gone to grave sites of Allied soldiers and laid wreaths today and yesterday and in the last few days.
You were at Omaha Beach earlier today, Anna Maria. What will you remember most about watching that ceremony?
Well, it was extraordinary to be in a place with so many world leaders and to see everyone celebrating this all together. But the things that will stick in my mind are the individual moments. There was one veteran on a beach, and his wife was rolling a video camera, and he was pointing, and he was trying to explain where he was on that day to the video camera. And when he finished, he looked at the camera and he named his grandchildren, and he says, "This is for you, so you won't forget." And I think for me that was probably the most touching moment in this day.
Thanks very much for telling us about it, Anna Maria.
Okay, Allison, good night.
Before we go tonight, we're joined by the CBC's Brian Stewart, who's been in Normandy throughout this time. Brian, you've covered wars, you've covered anniversary celebrations similar to this one. What goes through your mind as you watch events like you saw today?
Well, I think more than anything else, when I look at the veterans and the gallant effort many of them made to march in various ceremonies today, is the extraordinary toughness of these people. I don't think it's possible. So you can't compare the wars of modern times to anything like the the ordeal they went through in the summer of 1944, the shock of that invasion, and then the ghastly Battle of Normandy, in which 5,000 Canadians died, and then 333 more days of marching across Europe. They're remarkably modest, and they talk about their modest role in the war, insist there weren't heroes, insist they played a small part. What they endured was absolutely incredible in terms of fear, hardship, and endurance, and it's a remarkable testament that so many of them are here. Though the saddest part of today is that you see them looking out to sea and the familiar places, and so many of them are saying at the same time this is probably the last time they will ever see Normandy, and it's the last close memory of the territory they fought through here.
And yet, Brian, while those soldiers may in some sense be modest, there were so many lofty words spoken today and so much emotion wrapped up over the past few days. Is there an after effect? What remains after something like this?
Well, I think there was a big after effect of the 40th anniversary, actually. There was it's watched very closely in Europe. It brings a kind of strong pan-European feeling to these events. There's the little hotel next to where I'm standing, the French couple own it. A German couple has visited. He used to serve in the Wehrmacht here in Cannes. He was one of the occupiers. They become great friends. He sent a telegram, or a fax rather, to the French owners of the hotel today saying, "I am terribly sorry I can't be with you. I know what must be going through your hearts as Frenchmen today." And they said that's the new Europe. And there is that extraordinary feeling that out of the crucible of war, the terrible events of 1944, has arisen a new Europe. And I think that feeling is very strong today, that what was done here has enabled the world to move on to a brighter future.
Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison.
And with that, we end our special report on the D-Day anniversary. Thank you for watching. I'm Alison Smith. There is more D-Day coverage coming up next on News World on Petrie and Prime with Ann Petrie. And join me later for The National.
Long time ago, but memories came rushing back today as D-Day was remembered on several continents. Years ago tonight, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops had accomplished the impossible. They had a beachhead on the Normandy coast of France, but at a horrific cost. And this was just the start. Half a century ago tonight, 395 Canadians lay dead, another 700 were wounded. 18,000 had hit Juno Beach that morning. They were young, and those who survived would never be the same again. Good evening. Cindy Burgess is on the morning shift this week. By the time the Normandy campaign had ended in August, the Canadian death toll had risen to 5,000, with 13,000 wounded. But it was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany.
We will bring you a complete wrap-up of D-Day commemorations from France, from across Canada, and from here in our region. But first, some of the things that happened today.
Only learning scant details of that momentous event that had taken place along the Normandy coast. It was the beginning of the end, and we'll look back on D-Day when Atlantic Pulse continues. A century ago, today was the day many had waited for, the culmination of D-Day commemorations in France.
Allied leaders and thousands of veterans gathered on the Normandy beaches today, where invasion forces dealt a decisive blow to the Nazi occupation of Europe 50 years ago.
Governor General Raina Tishon and Prime Minister Jean Chrétien joined other leaders in marking the D-Day milestone on the beach which saw the bloodiest battle, Omaha.
And I would like to thank everyone in the name of France.
French President François Mitterrand called the Allied invasion magnificent. He praised Canadian veterans for their unceasing efforts, saying they were always on the front lines. Mitterrand was a member of the French resistance during those war years. He said 50 years ago there was a great feeling of delivery when people heard the Allies had landed. Canadian veterans laid wreaths as a bugler played last post on the Normandy beach where they came ashore 50 years ago. 1,000 Canadians were either killed or wounded on Juno Beach, and veterans say they had to return to honor their fallen comrades. Chrétien told several hundred teary-eyed veterans they and their fallen comrades had won a great and lasting peace. Canadians then moved on to the war cemetery at Benny-sur-Mer nearby.